Chris Bennett, a millionaire CEO who had always avoided the idea of fatherhood, found his world turned upside down when a chance encounter in a park revealed a secret he never knew existed. As he stared at the little boy with green eyes who looked just like him, the question echoed in his mind: what happens when the life you've built is suddenly shattered by the truth? Chris Bennett was a man who lived and breathed business. As the CEO of one of the most successful companies in the country, his days were filled with meetings, negotiations, and making decisions that could change the course of industries. His focus was singular: success. Family, relationships, and anything outside of his business world were distractions, things he simply didn't have time for. He had always believed that his life would be defined by his accomplishments in the business world, and nothing more. His personal life had always taken a back seat, something he had willingly sacrificed in order to climb higher on the corporate ladder. Years ago, he had been in a relationship with a woman named Emma. It was short and intense, filled with passion, but also with distance. They were young and driven, each with their own ambitions, and their connection had fizzled out just as quickly as it had ignited. They parted ways, and that was the end of it. Or so Chris thought. There were no lingering feelings, no regrets, just the usual aftermath of a fleeting romance. He didn't know that Emma had left him with more than just a memory. One afternoon, while walking through a park near his office, Chris's mind was preoccupied with a recent deal. He wasn't paying attention to his surroundings until something caught his eye. He noticed a woman sitting on a bench, her face familiar. His heart skipped a beat when he recognized her. It was Emma. And next to her, sitting on the grass, was a small boy, playing with a ball. Chris paused, confused. Something about the child seemed familiar. The boy's hair was dark, and his features bore a striking resemblance to Chris. It took him a moment to piece it together, but when he did, his world shifted. He didn't know how to explain the feeling that washed over him. It was as though everything he had built, everything he had known, suddenly shattered. The child wasn't just any child, he looked like Chris. The same green eyes, the same dark brown hair, and the same mischievous smile. In that moment, Chris realized the impossible: he had a son. The realization hit him hard. He had never been told about the child, never had any indication that he was a father. His thoughts raced as he stood there, frozen, struggling to make sense of the situation. His mind flashed back to his time with Emma, and the pieces started to fit together. This boy, his son, was the one thing he had never known he had. And suddenly, everything he thought he understood about his life felt irrelevant. His legs moved of their own accord, bringing him closer to the bench. As he approached, Emma looked up and saw him, her expression shifting from surprise to recognition. There was no warmth in her eyes, just a guarded, cautious look, as if she had been expecting this moment but was still unsure of how to handle it. "Chris," she said quietly, almost as if she couldn't believe he was standing in front of her. Her voice held a mixture of surprise and something more, something that seemed to be tied to the past. "Emma," Chris's voice came out hoarse, still processing the shock of the situation. Is this my son?" Emma's eyes flickered to the boy beside her, and for a moment, there was hesitation. She hadn't expected this moment to come. They hadn't spoken in years, and now Chris was standing here, asking about a part of her life that she had kept hidden for so long. "Yes," she said quietly. "His name is Oliver." The words hit Chris like a punch to the stomach. Oliver. His son. The boy who had been sitting on the grass, laughing, playing, was his child. He felt as though he couldn't breathe. All the questions he had started to ask himself flooded his mind in that instant. Why hadn't Emma told him? How could she have kept this from him? But as he looked at Oliver again, those questions seemed to melt away. The boy's face was a mirror of his own, and in that moment, everything else faded. The business, the success, the carefully constructed life, it didn't matter. There was a child who needed him, a child he didn't even know existed until now. Why didn't you tell me, Emma? He asked, his voice almost a whisper. Emma looked down at Oliver, then back at Chris. I didn't think you'd want to be involved. I didn't think you'd be ready. Her voice was steady, but there was something vulnerable in the way she spoke, as though she had been carrying this weight for far too long. Chris was at a loss for words. He had spent years building a life that left no room for a family, and now, in front of him, was everything he never knew he wanted. His mind raced, trying to understand how this moment could have come to pass without his knowledge. His world, so neatly compartmentalized, had just been shattered by a reality he had never considered. I had no idea, Chris finally said, his voice filled with a mix of shock and regret. I never knew. Emma nodded, her eyes softening. I understand, Chris. But I've done everything I can to raise him on my own. He's my priority now, and I've tried to give him a life without complications. I wasn't sure how you'd fit into that. For a long moment, Chris stood there, his gaze fixed on Oliver. The boy was oblivious to the conversation taking place, his small hands gripping the ball as he bounced it against the ground. But Chris saw the resemblance. He saw his own face reflected in the child, and it was impossible to ignore the responsibility that had suddenly fallen on his shoulders. As the reality of the situation settled in, Chris felt a deep sense of unease. He wasn't sure what to do next, but one thing was clear, his life was about to change in ways he couldn't even begin to understand. He had always been in control of everything around him, but this was something completely out of his hands. And as much as he wanted to run from the responsibility, something inside him knew he couldn't. He had a son, and for better or worse, he was going to have to figure out what that meant. Chris stood there for a moment, unable to fully comprehend what Emma had just said. His mind raced, the words he had heard still echoing in his head, unable to fully make sense of them. Oliver. His son. It felt like a distant dream, something out of place in the perfectly controlled life he had spent years creating. But here was the undeniable truth standing right in front of him. The boy, the child who looked so much like him, was real. Chris's heart pounded in his chest, and 1,000 questions flooded his mind, but he couldn't bring himself to voice them just yet. Emma shifted uncomfortably on the bench, her eyes darting toward Oliver, who was still absorbed in his game. She could see the conflict in Chris's face, the confusion that had settled there like a cloud. She knew this was the last thing he had expected, the last thing anyone would expect. But Emma had known for years what it was like to carry that burden alone. She had made the decision to raise Oliver on her own, and while she had always hoped for a better life for him, she had never considered that Chris would be a part of it. She had thought he had moved on. She had thought he wouldn't care. I never meant to keep him from you, Chris, she said quietly, her voice steady but filled with the weight of the years that had passed. I just didn't know how to tell you. I wasn't sure you would want to know. Her eyes softened, looking at him with a mixture of regret and understanding. I didn't want to make things harder for you, or for him. He's my world now. I've raised him the best I could. Chris looked at Emma, his chest tight with confusion and anger, though he couldn't place exactly what he was angry about. He wanted to scream, to demand why she hadn't told him sooner, why she hadn't given him the choice to be involved. But he also understood the fear in her decision. He hadn't been a man who could be counted on, not in the way a child needed. He'd built his world on business deals, cold logic, and the drive for more. He had never been the type of man to settle down, never been the type to take on responsibility outside of his work. Why didn't you reach out to me? Chris asked finally, his voice thick with emotion. Why didn't you tell me when you found out? I had a right to know. Emma sighed, her gaze falling to her hands, wringing them nervously in her lap. She had replayed this conversation in her head countless times, but now that it was actually happening, she wasn't sure how to explain her choices. I was afraid, she admitted softly. I didn't think you'd want a child. I didn't think you'd want this life. And when he was born, I had no idea how to handle it. I thought maybe you'd be happier without us, without the complication. Chris felt a pang of guilt. He couldn't deny that he had been selfish. He had never thought about what might happen if Emma had a child, never considered the possibility that she might need help or that he could be a part of their lives. He had walked away from her, walked away from a relationship that could have meant something more, and now he was standing in front of a child he didn't know, a child who had been living without him for 4 years. He turned his gaze to Oliver, who had stopped playing and was now watching the two of them with curiosity. His green eyes, so much like his own, seemed to pierce through Chris. He had always imagined what it might be like to have children of his own, but never in a million years did he think he would be facing this moment. What kind of father could he possibly be to a boy he had never met, a boy who had been growing up without him, without any understanding of who he was? "Can I meet him?" Chris asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Can I talk to him?" Emma nodded, her eyes softening as she looked at her son. "He's a little shy around new people, especially men," she warned. "But you can try. He's been through a lot." Chris took a deep breath and approached Oliver slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements. He crouched down to Oliver's level, his heart racing as he looked into the boy's eyes. For a moment, there was silence, and then Oliver spoke, his voice small but clear. "Who are you?" Oliver asked, his eyes wide with curiosity. Chris swallowed hard, unsure of how to answer. He had never been good with children, let alone his own son, but he knew he had to start somewhere. I'm your dad," he said, his voice cracking slightly. The word felt foreign to him, but it was the truth. The moment the word left his mouth, he felt a rush of emotions. A mixture of fear, guilt, and a strange sense of connection he hadn't anticipated. Oliver blinked, as if trying to understand what he was being told. Then, slowly, he asked, "Are you going to stay?" Chris looked at him, and for the first time in years, he felt a weight on his shoulders that wasn't tied to a business deal or a deadline. It was the weight of responsibility, of the kind of commitment he had avoided for so long. "I'm going to try," Chris said quietly. "I'm going to try to be here for you." Emma watched the exchange with a mixture of hope and apprehension. She had always done everything on her own, but now, she was letting someone else into her life. She wasn't sure if Chris would stay, but for the first time in a long time, she was willing to take a chance. Oliver had the right to know his father, and maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something that could be good for all of them. Chris stood up, looking at Emma, his mind racing. He had no idea how to be a father, no idea how to make up for the time he had missed, but he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't walk away now. The boy standing before him was his son, and for better or worse, he was going to have to figure out how to be the father that Oliver needed. Chris couldn't shake the feeling that his entire world had shifted in the blink of an eye. After that first, awkward meeting with Emma and Oliver in the park, he spent the following days in a daze. He kept replaying the conversation in his mind, the sight of his son still vivid in his memory. The way Oliver's green eyes had looked at him, full of confusion and curiosity, made him realize how much time he had lost. But even more than that, it made him realize how little he knew about being a father. He had no idea how to take care of a child, especially one who had already been through so much without him. At work, he found it difficult to focus. His mind kept drifting back to the park, to Oliver. It wasn't just the shock of finding out that he had a son that unsettled him. It was the weight of the responsibility now resting on his shoulders. He had always been someone who thrived on control, whether it was in the boardroom or in his personal life. But now, he had no control. He didn't know how to navigate this new role as a father, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for the challenges that would come with it. By the end of the week, Chris found himself on the phone with Emma again, arranging a time to meet. He wasn't sure what he expected from the meeting, but he knew he couldn't ignore this anymore. The idea of being a father, of stepping up for Oliver, was terrifying, but it was also undeniable. He couldn't let the boy remain a stranger to him. They met at a small cafe on the outskirts of the city. The setting was quiet, peaceful, and Chris found himself grateful for the calm. Emma was already seated when he arrived. She looked up from the menu when he walked in, and their eyes met. There was a certain wariness in her gaze, but also a hint of something else, hope, maybe. He wasn't sure. He walked over to the table and sat down. "Thanks for meeting me," Chris said, breaking the silence. Emma nodded, pushing the menu aside. "Of course. I know this isn't easy for you." Chris ran a hand through his hair, still unsure of how to approach the conversation. "I don't know what I'm doing, Emma," he admitted. "I've never been a father. I've never thought about what that would mean. But now, I don't know how to ignore this." Emma watched him carefully, her expression softening. "I understand. But you don't have to figure it all out overnight, Chris. You don't have to be perfect. I'm not asking for perfection. I just want you to be there for him." "I want to be there," Chris said, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "I just don't know how." Emma leaned forward, her eyes fixed on him. "You don't have to do everything right. Just show up. Spend time with him. Get to know him. He's not asking for you to be some kind of hero. He's asking for you to be his dad. And that's enough." Chris nodded slowly, absorbing her words. It sounded so simple when she put it that way, but he knew it wasn't going to be easy. There were so many things he didn't know about Oliver, about the way his son thought, what made him laugh, what made him feel safe. And there were so many things he needed to learn about himself, how to let go of his fears, how to be vulnerable, how to stop controlling everything and just let life unfold. "I know it won't be easy," Chris said, his voice quieter now. "But I'm willing to try. I don't know where to start, but I'll start. For him." Emma smiled faintly, relief evident in her eyes. "That's all I can ask for, Chris. Just be there for him. He needs you, even if he doesn't know it yet." The conversation shifted after that. They talked about logistics, about when Chris could spend time with Oliver, what his routine was like, how Emma was managing with everything. Chris learned more about his son in those few minutes than he ever thought he could. It wasn't a lot, but it was a start. After the meeting, as Chris walked back to his car, he couldn't help but think about the responsibility he had just taken on. He had made the decision to be part of Oliver's life, but the reality of it was still settling in. He wasn't sure what the future would look like, but for the first time in a long time, he was willing to face it. He had a son. And no matter how overwhelming that was, he was determined to make it work. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of new experiences and challenges. Chris spent time with Oliver whenever he could. They went to the park together, played games, and talked. At first, it was awkward. Oliver was reserved around him, unsure of who this stranger was in his life. But Chris kept showing up, day after day, doing his best to be patient, to learn about his son, and to find the right balance between being a father and allowing Oliver to feel comfortable with him. It wasn't perfect. There were moments of silence, of uncertainty, but there were also moments of connection. A laugh shared over a silly joke. A smile when Oliver ran up to him with a picture he had drawn. Chris found himself softening in ways he hadn't expected. As he spent more time with Oliver, he began to understand just how much he had been missing. Being a father wasn't about having all the answers or being in control, it was about being there, in the moment, and letting the relationship grow organically. One afternoon, as they sat together on the porch after a long day, Oliver leaned his head against Chris's shoulder. It wasn't much, just a small gesture, but it meant everything. It was a sign that, despite everything, they were beginning to build something real, something lasting. And Chris knew, in that moment, that he had made the right choice. He had started a journey he wasn't sure he was ready for, but it was the journey that would define the rest of his life. For the first time, he realized that this, being Oliver's father, was the most important thing he would ever do. The weeks that followed Chris's decision to be a part of Oliver's life were a mix of emotions and adjustments. Each day was a learning curve, and every moment with Oliver left him with a new realization about what it meant to be a father. At first, the time they spent together felt forced, like both of them were just going through the motions. Oliver was still unsure, keeping his distance, and Chris, who had always been confident in business matters, felt lost in this new, unfamiliar world of parenting. Despite the awkwardness, Chris was committed to trying. He kept showing up, no matter how uncomfortable it felt, no matter how many times Oliver withdrew from him. It was all he could do: be present, be patient, and allow time to do its work. Chris found himself looking at Oliver with a sense of awe. The boy was so much like him, his green eyes, his tousled brown hair, but there was so much he didn't know about him. Oliver was cautious, quiet, and often kept to himself. He didn't talk much about his past, about what he had gone through before Chris came into the picture. But there were small moments when Chris would catch a glimpse of the boy he was becoming, moments of laughter, moments of joy that were completely unprompted. And with each moment like that, Chris felt a sense of relief. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. They were slowly building trust, slowly learning how to be a family. One Saturday afternoon, after they had spent the morning together, walking through the park and playing catch, Oliver sat down on the grass, looking up at the sky. He was quiet, his hands clasped in his lap, as he watched the clouds pass by. Chris sat next to him, not wanting to disturb the quiet, but also unsure of how to break the silence. He had learned that sometimes, the best thing he could do was just sit with Oliver, allow the boy to open up when he was ready. After a while, Oliver spoke, his voice small and uncertain. Do you think I'm like you?" he asked, not looking at Chris. Chris blinked, the question catching him off guard. He had never really thought about it. Of course, Oliver looked like him, he could see that in every feature, in the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, but it was the first time the boy had asked something so personal. It was a question that struck a chord deep within Chris. What did it mean for Oliver to be like him? Did he want to be like him? Was he hoping for some kind of connection, some kind of approval? Chris wasn't sure. "You're your own person," Chris said, his voice quiet but firm. "You don't have to be like me. You're you. And that's more than enough." Oliver didn't respond right away. He just looked up at the sky again, his expression unreadable. Chris wasn't sure if the boy fully understood what he meant, but he hoped he did. The last thing Chris wanted was for Oliver to feel like he had to live up to some kind of ideal or expectation. He just wanted him to feel accepted, loved for who he was. The next day, Chris picked Oliver up for their usual weekend outing. They had decided to spend the day at the zoo, something they had done a few times now. Chris had learned that Oliver loved animals, especially the monkeys. As they walked through the exhibits, with the sound of children laughing and the hum of the crowd around them, Chris watched as Oliver's face lit up when he saw the monkeys swinging from the trees. He could see the joy in the boy's eyes, something he hadn't seen when they first met. There was a spark in him now that wasn't there before. They spent hours at the zoo, laughing, talking about the animals they saw, and enjoying each other's company in a way that felt easy, comfortable. It wasn't perfect, but it felt real. There were no expectations, no pressure. They were just two people getting to know each other, finding moments of happiness together. Later that evening, after they returned home, Chris helped Oliver with his dinner and then settled in for the night. As they sat together on the couch, watching TV, Oliver looked up at him and said, "I had fun today." Chris smiled, his heart swelling at the simple but powerful words. "I did too, buddy," he replied. "I'm glad we spent the day together." Oliver smiled back, a genuine smile that Chris hadn't seen much of before. It was a smile that made everything feel worth it, all the awkward moments, all the uncertainty. This was the reason he was doing this. This was why he had made the decision to be a part of Oliver's life. As Chris tucked Oliver into bed that night, he kissed him on the forehead, something he hadn't done before. The gesture felt strange at first, but when Oliver didn't pull away and simply closed his eyes with a small sigh, Chris realized that this was exactly what the boy needed. It was a small step, but it was progress. Over the next few weeks, Chris continued to spend more time with Oliver, gradually learning how to be there for him, how to listen, and how to give him the space he needed. They started to bond in small ways, with Chris picking him up from school and taking him to the park or helping him with his homework. There were still moments of awkwardness, moments when Chris wasn't sure what to say or how to act, but they were becoming fewer. What mattered most was that Chris was showing up, that he was trying, and that he was here for Oliver in a way he hadn't been before. One evening, as they were sitting at the dinner table, Oliver looked up from his plate and said, "I think I like it when you're here." Chris's heart stopped for a moment. The simple words hit him harder than he expected. He didn't know what to say at first, but he finally replied, "I like being here too, Oliver. I like spending time with you." In that moment, Chris knew that they were starting to build something real. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, and there would be more challenges, but he was willing to face them. He had made the decision to be a father, and now, more than ever, he was committed to being there for Oliver, no matter what. Chris had always prided himself on being able to control every aspect of his life. He thrived in the fast-paced world of business, where decisions were made quickly, results were immediate, and everything had a clear, defined purpose. But with Oliver, things were different. There was no quick solution, no set formula for fatherhood. It was an ongoing process, one that Chris wasn't sure he was prepared for. Yet, the more time he spent with Oliver, the more he realized how important this was. Being a father wasn't about having all the answers, it was about showing up, being there, and trying his best, even when it felt like he was fumbling in the dark. As the weeks went by, Chris began to feel more comfortable in his role as a father. It wasn't perfect, and there were still many moments when he felt out of his depth, but there was something about Oliver that made everything worthwhile. The boy had a quiet, cautious nature, but there were flashes of light, moments of joy when he'd laugh at a silly joke or show Chris a new drawing he'd made. Those moments, no matter how small, felt like progress. They were starting to connect, starting to build a relationship, one that was based on trust and time. One afternoon, Chris took Oliver to a nearby park. It had become one of their favorite spots, a place where they could be themselves without the pressure of the outside world. As they walked through the park, with the sun beginning to set and the sky painted in shades of orange and pink, Chris noticed how at ease Oliver seemed. He wasn't the shy, withdrawn boy Chris had first met. There was a new confidence in him, a sense of belonging that Chris hadn't seen before. Oliver ran ahead, kicking a soccer ball across the grass, his laughter echoing in the open space. Chris watched him, a small smile on his face. He had always been a man of logic and order, but seeing Oliver so carefree, so happy, made him realize just how much he had been missing. He wasn't sure when it happened, but somewhere along the way, he had fallen in love with being Oliver's father. It wasn't about perfect moments or grand gestures, it was about these simple, everyday things. The way Oliver's face lit up when he made a goal, the way he would run to Chris with open arms after each small victory, as if seeking validation from the one person who had once been a stranger. Later, as they sat on the park bench, eating ice cream and watching the sun dip lower in the sky, Chris felt a peace he hadn't experienced in years. He had been so focused on building his empire, so wrapped up in his career, that he had forgotten what it meant to simply be present. Now, with Oliver beside him, he was learning what it meant to be truly alive, to find joy in the small moments, to embrace the uncertainty of parenthood, and to find fulfillment in the process, not just the end result. "This is nice," Oliver said, his voice soft as he licked his ice cream. Chris glanced over at him, a warmth filling his chest. "Yeah, it is. I'm glad we're here." Oliver smiled, his eyes sparkling. "Me too." In that moment, Chris realized that everything he had been afraid of, the responsibility, the uncertainty, the lack of control, had faded away. It wasn't about being perfect, it was about being there for Oliver, being the steady presence he needed. And in return, Oliver had started to trust him, to rely on him, in a way that he never had before. That evening, when they returned home, Chris sat on the couch, still processing the day. It wasn't anything extraordinary, but it was meaningful. They had shared something real, something that mattered. It was these moments, these simple, everyday experiences, that made everything worthwhile. It was the connection they were building, step by step, that would define their future. The next day, as Chris went about his work, his thoughts kept drifting back to Oliver. He found himself smiling randomly, remembering the way the boy had laughed when he scored that goal, the way his face had lit up when he saw the ice cream truck. It wasn't the big moments that made the difference. It was the little things, the shared glances, the quiet conversations, the trust being slowly built. As the weeks continued to pass, Chris's relationship with Oliver deepened. They began to develop their own routines, their own inside jokes. Chris started taking on more responsibility, helping with homework, picking him up from school, and even learning how to be patient when Oliver had bad days. It wasn't always easy, and there were times when Chris felt like he was failing, but he kept trying. He wasn't perfect, but he was learning. One evening, as Chris tucked Oliver into bed, the boy looked up at him with a tired smile. "Thanks for today, Dad," he said softly, the words still strange but comforting. Chris smiled, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and love. "Anytime, kiddo." As he left the room and closed the door behind him, Chris stood in the hallway for a moment, his mind spinning. He had made so many mistakes in the past, so many decisions he wished he could take back. But being Oliver's father, however imperfectly, wasn't one of them. It was the best thing he had ever done, the thing that made all the other successes feel insignificant in comparison. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he felt ready to face it, with Oliver by his side. And that, he realized, was all that really mattered. The days started to feel more routine for Chris, though he would never say they were easy. Each new day presented challenges, and each day also brought small victories, things that were hard for him to notice in the midst of his old life. There was no checklist for this, no guidebook to follow. He was learning to parent in real time, with every decision feeling like a step forward or a step back. He had expected to feel a deep sense of guilt over not being there for Oliver before, but he was surprised to find that guilt slowly being replaced with a growing sense of responsibility. The more he was around his son, the more he realized that he wasn't just trying to fix the past, he was shaping the future. One evening, after work, Chris found himself picking Oliver up from school. It was still a bit awkward. The other kids were always so comfortable with their parents, laughing and talking as they waited for them. But Chris had to admit, he was still learning what it meant to be involved in these little moments. It wasn't just about picking him up, it was about getting to know the rhythms of his life, about learning the things that made Oliver smile, or the things that bothered him. "How was school today?" Chris asked as he pulled away from the school parking lot, trying to make small talk. Oliver didn't answer right away, his eyes fixed out the window. It was becoming a familiar pattern. Oliver was often quiet, lost in his own thoughts. Chris tried to be patient, but it was hard to know how to break through to him. The silence stretched out for a few moments, and just as Chris was about to ask another question, Oliver spoke. "It was okay," he said quietly, but then added, "We had a test in math. I think I did bad." Chris's heart tightened. He had seen Oliver struggle with schoolwork before, but hearing it spoken out loud felt different. "You think you did bad?" he asked, glancing at him quickly. "I don't know," Oliver said with a shrug. "I don't like math. It's too hard." Chris felt a wave of sympathy for him. He remembered how he had struggled with some subjects growing up. His parents had never been particularly nurturing when it came to academics, so it had been up to him to figure things out. And here he was, facing a similar situation with his own son. He had to be the one to provide the support that Oliver needed. But how? He wasn't a teacher. He wasn't an expert at comforting kids over school struggles. He wasn't sure what was expected of him. "How about we work on it together?" Chris suggested, trying to sound as casual as possible. "I may not be a math expert, but we can figure it out together." Oliver looked at him, his expression uncertain. "Really?" Chris nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah. We'll make it fun. It won't be as bad as you think." The small smile Oliver gave him in return was enough to reassure Chris that, maybe, just maybe, they were getting somewhere. That night, they sat together at the kitchen table, Chris patiently explaining a few basic math concepts. At first, it felt clumsy, but as they went through the problems, Chris found himself genuinely enjoying the time spent with Oliver. It wasn't about the math, it was about the connection. Oliver's concentration and the small moments of laughter when things started to make sense made Chris feel like they were building something real, brick by brick. By the end of the session, Oliver had solved the problems with more confidence than Chris expected. "See? Told you it wasn't that bad," Chris said with a grin. Oliver looked up at him, his face softening. "Thanks, Dad." Chris paused, taken aback. For the first time, it didn't feel forced. It wasn't just the awkward "Dad" that Chris had heard before, it felt like a genuine recognition. Oliver was starting to trust him, and Chris, despite the uncertainties, was starting to feel like he could be the kind of father Oliver needed. The next few weeks passed in much the same way, a mix of challenges and small triumphs. Chris spent more and more time with Oliver, picking him up from school, attending his soccer games, and helping him with homework. They still had their awkward moments, but there was something more tangible now, something that was growing between them. Chris wasn't perfect. He made mistakes, and there were still times when he felt like an outsider in his own life, struggling to catch up. But with each new day, he felt more and more like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. One evening, after a particularly hard day at work, Chris came home to find Oliver sitting on the couch with a drawing pad in front of him. The boy had always been quiet about his interests, but lately, Chris had noticed him drawing more. It wasn't something Chris had expected to find him doing, but when he saw the pictures, he understood it was a part of Oliver that he hadn't fully seen before. There were images of animals, some of which Chris recognized, but it was the drawings of people that struck him the most. There was one in particular, a picture of two figures, one with brown hair and the other with dark, curly hair. The one with curly hair was holding the other's hand, a simple but tender gesture. It was Chris and Oliver. Chris approached the couch slowly, unsure of how to comment on the drawing. "Hey, that's pretty good," he said, trying to sound casual. Oliver looked up, his cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "It's just a drawing," he muttered, quickly covering it with his hand. Chris sat down beside him. "No, it's really good. You've got some talent, kid." Oliver shrugged but didn't push the conversation away. "I like drawing people," he said quietly. "I draw them like they're happy." Chris looked at the drawing again. "That's a nice way to do it," he said thoughtfully. "You know, I'm not great at drawing, but maybe you could teach me a few things." Oliver's face lit up, and for the first time in a long while, Chris saw the kind of joy that made everything feel worth it. He realized that the small moments were the ones that counted. The simple things, spending time together, sharing experiences, being there for each other, were slowly building something that neither of them had known they needed. As the days turned into weeks, Chris found himself feeling more fulfilled than he had in years. He was no longer just a man who built a company, he was becoming a father. And even though he didn't have all the answers, he was beginning to understand what it meant to be a part of something greater than himself. It was hard work, full of unknowns and difficult decisions, but every moment with Oliver felt like a step in the right direction. No matter how tough things got, he knew that the connection between them was real. And that, more than anything else, made all the difference. The days had started to blend together for Chris, each one an extension of the last. Life was still full of uncertainty, but something inside him had shifted. He no longer viewed himself as an outsider in Oliver's life. With each passing day, they were becoming more than just a father and son, they were forming a bond, one built on the quiet moments, the patience, and the willingness to try. Chris had never been one to open up, never been someone who found solace in emotional connections, but there was something about Oliver that made it impossible to ignore. For the first time in a long time, Chris was realizing that his life was no longer defined by his career or his success. It was being defined by this small, quiet boy, and that realization both terrified and exhilarated him. One night, after a long week of meetings and work, Chris came home to find Oliver sitting at the kitchen table, looking over a math worksheet. Chris had seen him struggle with school before, but this time, something was different. Oliver was focused, determined, his little brow furrowed in concentration as he worked through the problems. Chris watched him for a moment, admiring the quiet determination in his son's face. It wasn't just about solving the problems, it was about his willingness to keep going, even when things got tough. "How's it going, buddy?" Chris asked, his voice breaking the silence in the room. Oliver looked up, his green eyes meeting Chris's, and Chris noticed a hint of frustration in them. "I don't get it," he said, pushing the paper aside. "I keep messing up, and it doesn't make sense." Chris walked over to him and sat down at the table. "Math can be tough," he said, offering a reassuring smile. "But we can figure it out together." Oliver sighed, running a hand through his messy hair. "I know, but it feels like I'm never going to get it. It's like I'm always stuck." Chris's heart ached as he watched Oliver, so full of promise but also full of doubt. He wasn't sure how to make things easier for him, but he knew he had to try. For the first time, Chris felt the weight of being a father in a way that wasn't just about providing or being there physically. It was about being present in these quiet moments, the ones where the real work of parenting happened. He wasn't just teaching Oliver math, he was teaching him to believe in himself, to keep going when things felt hard, to trust that he had the ability to succeed. "We'll take it slow," Chris said, leaning over the paper. "Let's break it down together. One step at a time." They worked through the problems together, and with Chris's help, Oliver began to understand the steps needed to solve them. Chris didn't just give him the answers, he guided him, asked questions that made Oliver think for himself. Slowly, Oliver's frustration faded, replaced by a quiet satisfaction as he solved the problems one by one. "See?" Chris said, offering a grin. "Told you could do it." Oliver smiled, though it was a small one. "Thanks, Dad." The words hit Chris harder than he expected. He had heard them before, but they had never felt so real, so full of meaning. It wasn't just a casual acknowledgement. It was the start of something bigger. It was a sign that they were no longer two strangers trying to figure each other out. They were a family, and that, for Chris, was more than he had ever expected to find. As the weeks continued, Chris's relationship with Oliver deepened. He took more time off from work, making a conscious effort to be there for Oliver. Whether it was attending school events, helping with homework, or simply sitting together on the couch at night watching TV, Chris made it a point to be involved in his son's life. There were still awkward moments, of course, but they were becoming fewer and fewer. Oliver was starting to open up more, sharing stories from his day, laughing at Chris's attempts to tell jokes, and even asking him questions about his work. The boy had started to trust him, and that trust was something Chris would never take for granted. One weekend, Chris took Oliver to the beach for the first time. They spent the entire day playing in the sand, building castles, and splashing in the water. For Chris, it was a surreal experience. He had always been focused on the future, on what came next, on what was important in the grand scheme of things. But today, as he watched Oliver chase after waves and laugh without a care in the world, Chris realized that this was what truly mattered. This moment. The connection they had, the simple joys of being together, was all that mattered in the end. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the ocean, Chris sat on the sand next to Oliver, watching as the boy continued to play in the surf. Oliver ran up to him, his face bright with excitement. "Look, Dad. I made a big splash," he shouted, his voice full of pride. Chris smiled, his heart swelling with emotion. "That was awesome, buddy. You're getting really good at this." Oliver beamed, his confidence shining through. "You should come in and try. We could make an even bigger splash together." Chris hesitated for a moment, the familiar voice of his doubts whispering in the back of his mind. He wasn't the kind of person who liked to let loose, who enjoyed getting wet or making a fool of himself. But in that moment, with Oliver looking up at him, waiting for him to join in, Chris realized that it didn't matter. What mattered was showing up for his son, being present in his life in ways that mattered to him. So, without another thought, he stood up and ran toward the water, laughing as the waves crashed against them. For the first time in a long time, Chris felt truly alive. He wasn't just living for himself anymore. He was living for Oliver, for the future they were building together. There would be challenges ahead, moments of doubt and frustration, but in this moment, Chris knew that he had made the right choice. He had embraced fatherhood not because he was perfect, but because he was willing to try. And in doing so, he was becoming the father that Oliver deserved. The months that followed felt like a blur for Chris, a series of moments, big and small, that all seemed to lead him toward the same realization: his life was no longer just his own. It belonged to Oliver, to the family they were becoming together. Chris had never imagined himself as the kind of man who would change so drastically, but here he was, fully immersed in fatherhood. Every day brought something new: challenges, triumphs, moments of frustration, but also moments of pure joy. For the first time, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment that his success in business had never given him. One evening, after a long day at work, Chris came home to find Oliver sitting in the living room with a book in his lap. Chris had come to recognize that reading was one of Oliver's favorite pastimes, though he often kept it to himself. Chris smiled, watching the boy quietly absorbed in the pages of his book. It was a simple moment, but it meant everything. Oliver had come so far from the quiet, reserved child he had first met. He was becoming more confident, more open. He was learning to trust Chris, and for that, Chris was grateful. "Hey, buddy," Chris said, stepping into the room. Oliver looked up, his face lighting up when he saw him. "Hi, Dad," Oliver said, his voice bright with warmth. "I'm reading about animals. Did you know elephants can weigh over 6 tons? Chris chuckled, impressed by the boy's enthusiasm. "I didn't know that, but I'm glad you're learning new things. Maybe we should take a trip to the zoo this weekend." Oliver's face lit up at the suggestion. "Can we? Please?" Chris nodded. "Of course. Let's make it a fun day. We'll go early and spend the whole day there." As the days passed, Chris continued to make an effort to be present in Oliver's life. He attended his school events, helped with homework, and always made time for their weekend outings. But it wasn't just the big things that mattered, it was the small moments that were becoming more significant. It was the way Oliver looked at him with trust in his eyes, the way the boy seemed to seek him out when he needed reassurance, the way they could now share quiet moments together without it feeling forced. These were the things that made Chris realize how deeply he had fallen into this role of being a father. It wasn't always easy. There were days when Chris felt overwhelmed by the responsibility, days when he wondered if he was doing enough, if he was saying the right things, or if Oliver was truly happy. But every time he felt doubt creep in, he would see something in Oliver that reminded him that they were on the right path. It wasn't about being perfect, it was about showing up, being consistent, and being there for Oliver, no matter what. One afternoon, Chris was sitting at the kitchen table, going through some work documents, when Oliver came into the room holding a small, folded piece of paper. He looked nervous, as though he was unsure whether he should show it to Chris. "What's this?" Chris asked, setting the papers aside. Oliver hesitated for a moment before handing it over. "It's for you. I made it in school," he said softly. Chris unfolded the paper and saw a drawing, a simple picture of him and Oliver, both smiling. Oliver had drawn them standing side by side, with a small sun shining above them and a few trees in the background. Chris's heart swelled in his chest. It wasn't just a drawing, it was a representation of the bond they were forming, of the life they were building together. In that moment, all of his doubts about whether he was doing things right faded away. He had been given this gift, this incredible chance to be part of Oliver's life, and it was worth every effort. "This is amazing, buddy," Chris said, his voice thick with emotion. "I love it. Thank you." Oliver smiled, a shy but genuine smile. "You're welcome, Dad." As Chris looked at the drawing, he realized how far they had come. From the first awkward meeting in the park to this moment, where Oliver had willingly shared a piece of his heart with him, their relationship had grown in ways Chris hadn't thought possible. Oliver had opened up to him in ways he never expected, and Chris had learned to embrace fatherhood in ways he had never imagined. It wasn't just about the big moments, it was about the everyday moments, the quiet acts of love and care that they shared. Later that night, as Chris tucked Oliver into bed, he paused for a moment, looking at the boy lying there, his eyes heavy with sleep. Oliver had come so far since the first time they had met, and so had Chris. They had learned from each other, and they had grown together. Chris leaned down and kissed Oliver on the forehead, something he had come to do every night. It was a simple gesture, but it meant everything. "I love you, Oliver," Chris whispered, his voice soft but full of sincerity. Oliver's eyes fluttered open, and he smiled sleepily. "I love you too, Dad." Chris stood up, feeling a rush of emotion. He had come into this journey unsure of everything, unsure of how to be a father, unsure of how to make things right. But in that moment, he knew he was exactly where he needed to be. There would be more challenges ahead, more obstacles to overcome, but for the first time, Chris felt a sense of peace. He was no longer just a man trying to survive in a world of business. He was a father, and that was everything. As Chris left Oliver's room and closed the door behind him, he stood there for a moment, taking in the quiet of the house. He realized that his life had changed in ways he could never have predicted. It wasn't about wealth, success, or status anymore. It was about the love he had for his son and the love his son had for him. In the grand scheme of things, that was all that mattered. And as Chris moved forward, he knew that everything he had worked for in his life had led him to this point. Being a father was the greatest accomplishment of all, and he was ready to embrace it fully. In my view, the ending of this story serves as a powerful reminder that life doesn't always go according to plan, but that doesn't mean it isn't meaningful or fulfilling. Chris, who spent most of his life focused on business success and avoiding personal connections, discovers a profound sense of purpose through the unexpected arrival of his son, Oliver. His journey isn't without its challenges, but the transformation he undergoes, from a man afraid of emotional vulnerability to a father who learns to embrace love and responsibility, feels authentic and earned. What makes the ending so powerful is the realization that parenthood doesn't come with a perfect roadmap. It's not about achieving perfection, but about showing up, making mistakes, and trying again. By the end, Chris doesn't need to have all the answers, he just needs to be present for Oliver. The bond they form is messy, imperfect, but incredibly real. For Chris, the true fulfillment comes not from his business empire, but from the relationships he builds, and in this case, it's the relationship with his son that teaches him what it means to truly live. The ending is also heartwarming because it demonstrates the idea of second chances, not just in relationships, but in life itself. Chris finds himself in a situation he never anticipated, but through his willingness to learn and adapt, he's able to build something new and beautiful. It's a story about growth, healing, and how love can transform even the most guarded hearts.